Culture is also something that can be adaptive or maladaptive. So it can be used strategically to help us solve adaptive problems. It can be, some cultural expressions can be detrimental to our health and survival. The reliance on social and cultural adaptation has, of course, increased over the course of human evolution. So as we started to rely on tools more, control fire, etc., then culture became even more important. We use culture instrumentally to fulfill basic biological needs. But there are cultural patterns that, in the long run, can be detrimental. So, if we think about things like overconsumption and pollution, these are not beneficial to ourselves, to our survival as a species. It in fact, can threaten our survival and reproduction. But we still do it. Why do we do it? Well, because historically, evolutionarily, if you overconsumed, it was a sign of wealth. And that status boost that you got from public displays of wealth outweighed any damage those displays of wealth may have done to the environment or even to people less fortunate than you. So, as we talked about the development of agriculture and then the introduction of state level stratified societies, right? It was in these state level stratified societies where it really becomes firmly entrenched that we have displays of wealth as advertisements. Culture has an evolutionary basis. There are cultural features that we share with primates, such as group living, such as, of course, tool use. But there's a substantial gap between what we see in primate society and then fully elaborated human culture. Both primates and humans learn from experience and change their behavior as a result. So they are able to modify the behaviors they do based on the kind of response that they get from it. Both primates and humans use tools, both opportunistic and premeditated. The skewering of bush babies, for example, is certainly something that's premeditated and is perhaps a bit more cultural than modifying stones or than carrying stones around for nut cracking, because you have to do a lot more modification. We also see that both humans and non-human primates hunt both solitarily and cooperatively. And when they hunt cooperatively, there is often food sharing that's engaged in afterwards with certain rules as to how that food's going to be shared. There are still some big differences in other primates. For one, cooperation and sharing are much more developed. So take a look at the two pictures on the right. We've got a chimpanzee with a mother, it's a mother and, no, it's actually an adult male, sorry. A chimpanzee adult male and a juvenile, or might still be bordering on infant. The infant clearly is begging for food. What does the adult male do? Kind of ignores the kid, sometimes pushes him away, doesn't give him food. And then on the right, we've got the Ache sharing widely. Everybody comes together for a communal meal to share what's been hunted and gathered that day. We also have different mating systems that result in different cultural patterns. And so that reflects these two pictures on the bottom left. The first picture shows you what an estrus swelling for chimpanzees can look like when you're at maximal tumescence. They're advertising that they're ovulating. Of course, chimps are doing it falsely because they're not really ovulating all the time that they're swollen. Humans completely hide ovulation and don't give any outward signal as to when they're ovulating. So what does this result in? Well, this results in different pair bonding behavior. We've got chimpanzees who are quite promiscuous. Multiple males mate with multiple females. We don't have any long-term pair bond. And we've got humans who, while not, let's say, evolutionarily monogamous, we do form long-term pair bonds, partly to ensure that we've got some knowledge of and kind of a certainty that we are the parents of that offspring. And, the reason really that we need to have that paternity certainty is because males not only stick around to make sure that they're the dad, but they're expected to invest in their offspring. And so, as hunter gatherers, that would have been through providing hunted game that would go to provision their offspring. We also have things like exogamy, where we might have requirements about marrying outside of our immediate social setting. We've got complex kinship systems. We also don't only track kinship through blood relationship. Think about our relationships of affinity, right? Do you treat your mother-in-law and your father-in-law, if you have them, as though they're kin? Oftentimes you do, even though in-laws are not actually biologically related to you as an individual. And in New Mexico, I mean, think about how many of you had some close family friend that you referred to as auntie, right? There are many cultures, and it's great explaining this to students in New Mexico that engage in fictive kinship, that have friends that they elevate to family status. So, these bullet points are not supposed to be something that are like, these are the only ways that we differ from other primates, but rather these are illustrative of the ways in which human cultural expression is more complex. So what do chimpanzees have that qualifies as culture? We would not qualify termite dipping or honey dipping or even the nut cracking tool use of chimpanzees as cultural features. And the main reason why is because there's no representation of abstract thought. Okay, they've got an adaptive problem, and they use the environment strategically just to fulfill or solve that adaptive problem. They need food. Termites are in season. They take a stick from their environment and dip it into the mound to get the termites. Or nuts are in season. They take a rock and use that then to smash open those nuts. So these cultural displays or cultural features have to be a bit more arbitrary. So there are some things that chimps do that do qualify as culture. And here what we've got pictured are greeting displays, right? What is the adaptive function of a greeting display? Well, it's just to identify in-group from out-group. Is there anything about the particular greeting displays that qualifies it as better fulfilling that function? I mean, think about, I don't know, Americans versus Europeans, right? In America, we shake hands. Europeans kiss on the cheek. So, is there something functionally different about shaking hands and kissing on cheeks? No, both just greet someone and kind of mark them as in-group versus out-group. And so what chimps do for greeting displays is similar. We've got the picture on the left here is chimps that are doing what many captive chimps do. Captive chimps, by and large, when they meet a new chimpanzee or they're reacquainted after a period of separation, they do something called a wrist present, where one will hold their wrist out to the other will inspect their wrist both with their nose and mouth and also with their fingers. So that's what they're doing here. The three pictures on the right show what chimps in the wild do. Chimps do some kind of hand clasp to mark in-group versus out-group behavior, but the form that the hand clasp can take can vary. So we see in the two pictures on the right, in the left one we've got just the fingers closing over the other hand, while on the right we've got the whole wrist going over the other wrist. So two different expressions both fulfill the same function. There's nothing adaptively better about just crossing your fingers over versus crossing your whole wrist over, right? Whether you do fingers or wrist is going to be based on the chimp culture that you grew up in. It is used to mark in-group versus out-group, but it's not like a better solution. And so for extra credit, if you'd like, and you would just email me this directly, you can Google the phrase chimpanzee fashion. Now this headline is a couple of years old, but it talks about a new behavior in chimps where they're starting to adorn their bodies with basically accessories. And so this picture on the left shows you that one of the things they do is stick pieces of grass in their ear. Well, the picture on the right shows you Thunder. He's much older now, looks fully adult, more fleshed out, bigger. He's at our zoo, and Thunder has been sticking grass in his ear since he was an infant. So just a little bit of humor that sometimes the quote-unquote new trends are not, in fact, new at all. All right, so that brings us to kind of how we compare cultural features. We have cultural universals, which are features that are found in every culture. One of these would be keeping track of kinship. Okay. Now, the way we keep track of kinship is not universal, but all cultures track kinship. We also have cultural generalities. These are features that are common to several or most, but not all human groups. And we've got cultural particularities, those that are unique to certain cultural traditions. So, with universal generalities, um, we've got things like biologically based universalities. We've got a long period of infant dependence. So guess what? All cultures have someone to take care of babies. We've got year-round sexuality. So we've got then long-term pair bonding. We've got a complex brain that enables us to use symbols, language, and innovate new tools. All of these are biologically based universals. We also have social universals. We don't, for example, live as hermits. We live in groups. We also keep track of kinship and family networks. Why is that not a biologically based universal? Well, because we don't use the same method to keep track of kinship. So in some cultures, or many cultures, we keep track of kinship through the nuclear family, mom, dad, and offspring. And children are considered related to both parents. But in some cultures, we keep track of kinship through descent groups, and you only belong to the descent group that one of your parents belong to. And so if it's patrilineal, you belong to the descent group of your father. If it's matrilineal, you belong to the descent group of your mother. This can result in the parent who's not being used to track kinship, not being considered related to their offspring. So, for example, Egypt, until relatively recently, women and children did not get their own passports. Rather, they were listed on their husband or father's passport. So if a woman was unmarried, she could not travel alone outside of the country. She would still be listed on her father's passport, even if she was in her 40s or 50s. And children could not leave the country with just their mother because they weren't considered related to their mother. Particularities are becoming increasingly rare because we've got a lot of borrowing of cultural traits. We've got things like the mass media, the internet, that have trends that then persist across national and international boundaries. Borrowed cultural traits, though, can often be modified to fit the culture that adopts them. So Australian Aborigines are obsessed with the movie Rambo. There's not any, let's say, ethnic affinity with Rambo, but they see it as kind of metaphorically representative of tribal organization and kind of that response against colonization. And so therefore they've done what we call indigenizing. They've indigenized Rambo to meet their own kind of cultural needs. But cultures do vary in beliefs, practices, integration, and patterning. And so as these cultural features are borrowed, they're going to be modified. They're going to be adapted to the culture that expresses them.